Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 24, The Last Merovingian King. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Frankia broke apart soon after Pippin's death. The Neustrians revolted, supported by an invasion from Frisia. Fortunately, Pippin's illegitimate son Charles drove the Frisians out of Austrasia. The Neustrians then allied with Odo, Duke of Aquitaine, but were defeated. Having reunited Frankia, Charles chose to expand into Frisia, so Aquitaine remained independent. However, Odo soon found himself facing another expansionist neighbor, Al-Andalus, Muslim-controlled Hispania. Although Odo won a major victory over the Muslim invaders, Charles saw an opportunity and burned his way through Aquitaine until Odo submitted. When the new governor of Al-Andalus attacked Aquitaine, Odo was too weak to defeat the invaders, so he had to ask Charles for help, thus acknowledging the Frankish king as his overlord. Together, they defeated the Muslims at Poitiers. Clearly, Charles did not fear any internal challenges. When Theodoric IV, the most recent figurehead ruler, died in 737, Charles did not bother replacing him with another king or appoint himself king. He just continued to run the kingdom and expand its borders, issuing charters in a dead man's name. Charles had not merely united Austrasia, Neustria, and Burgundy, he had conquered Frisia, roughly comparable to the modern Netherlands. He had also extended his rule into Provence, although he had to settle for overlordship of Aquitaine, which remained autonomous. Despite his hard work to reunite the Frankish kingdom, Charles divided it among his two oldest legitimate children. Carloman, the eldest, received Austrasia, Alamania, and Thuringia. Pippin, the second son, was given Burgundy, Neustria, and Provence, while his son Grifo from his second wife received lands across the region. It is doubtful that anyone openly opposed his decision to divide the kingdom, but it was a good question whether his sons would respect their father's wishes when he was dead. When Charles died on October 22, 741, it soon became clear that not all of Charles's wishes would be respected. Grifo felt that he was entitled to a greater share of power, but his brothers simply locked him up. Actually, he should have been grateful for the lenient treatment. Their cousin Theodald was executed, even though he had been spared by Charles. It may seem strange that the brothers worried about their cousin rather than their half-brother, but Charles had spared Theodald because he was a child. By the time Charles died, he had become an adult, and thus a potential rival for the throne. Aside from complex family issues, the brothers had to deal with other problems. Duke Hunald of Aquitaine naturally wanted to regain his autonomy, as did Theobald of Alemannia. It is almost as if they did not appreciate the benefits of submission to the Franks. Believing that the lack of legitimacy was the problem, not the fact that they were occupying other people's lands, the brothers transformed a monk into a new Merovingian king and proclaimed him Childeric III in 743. It is unknown if the presence of a Merovingian king on the throne of Frankia after an absence of 6 years had any impact on the situation, but at least Pippin and Carloman could claim that they were merely carrying out the will of the king, not raiding other people's lands for their own benefit. To be fair, the brothers began to achieve some success once they had a king. After a couple of invasions, Hunald bent the knee again in 745 and then retired to a monastery, leaving the duchy to his son Wifer. The situation in the east proved more difficult since the Alamans were supported by Odilo of Bavaria. Once Aquitaine had been pacified, the brothers marched against Bavaria. Odilo was able to retain his ducal throne, but had to surrender some lands. Still, at least he remained duke. The relatively lenient treatment of Odilo may have been due to his marriage to Chiltrude, sister to Carloman and Pippin. Strange as it may sound, Chiltrude apparently fled to Bavaria when Charles died, and then married Odilo. Honestly, little is known about the events leading up to Chiltrude's decision to marry Odilo. The romantic in me wants to believe that they were lovers, but Charles the Hammer had forbidden their marriage because it would give a foreign rival a claim to the throne, or, more accurately, the position of mayor. Regardless, Carloman and Pippin proved unwilling to depose their new brother-in-law. Alamania would not receive such favorable treatment. In fact, the Alamans made the greatest resistance to King Childeric III, represented by his loyal mayors, Carloman and Pippin. Repeated campaigns failed to completely pacify Alamania, so Carloman lost patience and executed many Alamanian nobles, which apparently ended the fighting. The duchy was then divided into 2 counties that were ruled by Franks. The 5 years since their father's death had been busy. The brothers fought a campaign each year, either together or separately against one of the several duchies that wanted to leave Frankia. While there was a loose alliance between the duchies, they never launched a coordinated attack against Frankia. In the end, they were worn down one by one. Aquitaine bent the knee, Bavaria accepted some form of submission, and Alamania was eliminated as a political entity. While it would have been natural to expect that the brothers would fight each other after their father died, they had remained united simply because they were busy trying to prevent the duchies of Aquitaine, Alamania, and Bavaria from gaining full independence. So, would they maintain this relationship once their rivals had been defeated? The answer is no, although there was no bloody civil war. Instead, Carloman abdicated in 746 and entered a monastery in far-off Italy. Given the lack of conflict between them, Carloman's decision to enter a monastery appears to have been a dramatic decision. Admittedly, he had carried out mass executions to end the Alamans' revolt, so maybe he wanted to repent for the senseless murders. However, it seems more likely that he either tired of the endless conflict or lost out in a power-sharing struggle, so he abdicated and traveled to Rome, where he became a monk. Regardless of whether Carloman genuinely repented his sins or had realized that his brother was getting tired of sharing power, his eldest son Drogo clearly intended to rule his father's lands, since he continued to appear in charters for about a year. However, he disappears from the records in late 748, leaving Pippin the unchallenged ruler of all of Frankia. It is hard to believe that Carloman abdicated and then his son happened to die of natural causes within the space of a year. Instead, it looks like Pippin wanted to reunite the Frankish kingdom. Since Pippin's wife Bertrada had given birth to their son Charles that April, Pippin may have felt sufficiently secure to remove his nephew Drogo and take his lands. As ever, it is worth asking why the brothers had been able to focus on ending the autonomy of the duchies of Aquitaine and Alamania without worrying about yet another invasion from Al-Andalus. Remember, their father, Charles the Hammer, had been fighting the Muslims for control of Provence for years. It seems unlikely that the raids would have stopped just because Charles had died. In fact, it had been a good question how long Charles could win against the Muslim attacks. Well, the situation changed dramatically because of a Berber revolt in Al-Andalus in 741. While the army that had conquered Visigoth Hispania was Muslim, it was not all Arab. In fact, most of the army was made up of Berbers, recruited in North Africa. Still, Arabs were in charge, and they unsurprisingly kept the best lands for themselves, leaving the frontier land to the Berbers. As the years passed, the Berbers resented their situation as they struggled to make a living from their poor lands. Meanwhile, a stream of Arab governors arrived and claimed fertile lands for themselves and their followers. Actually, Berbers on both sides of the Strait of Gibraltar had revolted against rule by a distant caliphate. Obviously, the Berber revolts ensured that there would be no raids north of the Pyrenees. A key factor behind the revolt was economic, since the Berbers resented their poor treatment, even though they had risked their lives to conquer Al-Andalus. Worse, the Caliphate had suffered several defeats in the previous decade. Faced with an empty treasury, the Caliph had begun to tax the Berbers. Obviously, the Berbers should not have had to pay taxes since they had converted to Islam, But the officials in the Caliph's taxation bureau had decided to tax lands, not individuals, so their status as believers no longer enabled the Berbers to avoid paying taxes. Part of the resentment was cultural, because the Berbers followed a stricter, more egalitarian form of Islam. But a key factor was simple resentment that Arabs were always put in charge. So, did the Caliph reconsider his over-reliance on Arabs as governors? No, he just sent an army to crush the revolt. Except the Caliph's army was slaughtered in October 741 in northern Morocco. The remnant of the Caliph's army was stuck in Ceuta, gradually running out of food until the governor of Al-Andalus made an offer: cross the strait and defeat the Berber revolt on the peninsula and then go back to North Africa. Unsurprisingly, the Caliph's soldiers accepted the generous offer. The Berbers were defeated, but Balj ibn Bishr, the commander of the army, became comfortable in Al-Andalus. The elderly governor was soon killed, but the rest of the local leadership resisted, and Balj died in the fighting. To outsiders, they were all Muslims, but the Arab conquerors of Hispania were Yemeni, who hated the Syrians who had come over with Balj. The fighting only stopped when a new governor persuaded the new arrivals to live in different parts of Al-Andalus. A fragile peace appeared, probably because enough people were tired of fighting, but there would be no large raids north of the Pyrenees. Instead, Al-Andalus would be on the defensive, struggling to hold on to Septimania. Okay, back to the Franks. Interesting, Carloman and Pippo's half-brother Grifo was viewed as a threat and was kept in custody until after Carloman retired. Once he was the unchallenged ruler of all of Frankia, Pippin freed Grifo and gave him his own county. Compared with the fate of their cousin Theodald, this seems like a really good outcome, but Grifo had been promised his own separate kingdom in the middle of Frankia until Pippin and Carloman had cut him out of the inheritance. Believing that he deserved more than a single county, Grifo left Frankia and fled to Bavaria. Why Bavaria? Admittedly, Duke Odilo was his uncle, but Odilo had just died. So, was Grifo taking advantage of his recent release to pay his respects to his grieving relatives? Not exactly. Since Pippin would not give him a kingdom, Grifo pushed his cousin Tassilo, Odilo's heir, out of the ducal chair so he could sit there. Grifo's success was probably due to his membership of the Agilolfing family, one of the most powerful families in Bavaria, who likely saw an opportunity to become the most powerful family in Bavaria. Now, Pippin felt that Grifo was a threat, so he intervened in 748 and put Tassilo back on the ducal chair. This intervention should not be viewed as a kind-hearted effort to prevent his half-brother from bullying his young cousin. Instead, Pippin had acted to prevent the Agilolfing family from making Bavaria an independent entity under Grifo. Since Tassilo was only 7 years old when he became duke, Pippin attempted to make him a Frankish vassal or at least dependent on Frankia. There was another factor behind the failure of Grifo to hold the Duchy of Bavaria. His half-sister was Chiltrude, Odilo's widow, so he may have expected that she would approve of him, or he thought that she would be unable to directly oppose him. However, her full brother was Pippin, who happily supported her desire to see her young son Tassilo become duke, and she served as a regent once Grifo was forced to leave Bavaria. Still, Grifo was his brother, so Pippin compensated him with 12 counties in Frankia, which is a lot more than one. While Pippin probably felt that he had found a solution that made everyone happy, Grifo disagreed. The problem proved to be the lack of autonomy, not the number of counties. So Grifo fled again, this time to Aquitaine. Pippin promptly sent a message to Duke Hunald demanding the return of his half-brother, but Grifo probably realized that he would not receive any more counties. In fact, there was a high probability that he would be blinded, so he fled to Lombardy but was killed by Frankish nobles on the way. Okay. Pippin had gained full control of both Neustria and Austrasia, as well as reduced Bavaria and Aquitaine to vassal states. He was still young, so what would he do next? Well, king sounded a lot better than mayor. While Charles had ruled for a period without the authority of a king, he had not dared to declare himself king. Since he no longer had any rivals, Pippin no longer saw the need for a figurehead king, so he was ready to take the next step and replace the Merovingian king, claiming that an unfit king should be deposed. Having increased his influence in the church through patronage and the appointment of relatives and members of allied families to bishoprics, Pippin won the support of Pope Zacharias to launch a coup against Childeric III, the current Merovingian king. It is important to remember that Childeric had been placed on the throne by Pippin and Carloman a few years earlier. Determined to make the process legitimate, or at least appear to be legitimate, Pippin arranged for forged genealogical records to show a relationship between his ancestors and the Merovingian line. Once all of the paperwork had been completed and approved, the king was deposed in November 751 and sent to a monastery, or more accurately, back to a monastery, while Pippin became king, anointed by his tame bishops. This was the first time that the ceremony was performed and was likely inspired by Celtic traditions in England, giving the growing influence of Anglo-Saxon monks. Furthermore, the famous missionary Boniface was chosen by Pope Zacharias to officiate at the ceremony. Aside from a promotion, Pippin's family then gained control of the estates that had belonged to the king, thus increasing their wealth. In the end, the revolution proved permanent, since none of his successors attempted to bring back a Merovingian, even as a figurehead. It should not be a surprise that when Pippin appointed himself king, with papal approval, he immediately abolished the office of mayor to avoid the danger of ambitious mayors. To sum up, when Charles the Hammer died, Francia was divided between his sons Pippin and Carloman. The brothers initially cooperated to crush attempts by Aquitaine and Alamania to leave Francia, but Carloman apparently tired of the conflict, or lost a power struggle with Pippin since he entered a monastery in 747. When his half-brother Grifo attempted to make himself Duke of Bavaria, Pippin intervened and placed his young cousin Tassilo on the ducal throne, conveniently making him a vassal of Francia at the same time. Pippin was dominant in Francia, but king sounded better than mayor, so Pope Zacharias was persuaded to support the coronation of Pippin as king of Francia. So, why did the Pope care who ruled Francia? I will answer that question next episode. Thanks for listening. If you like the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.